All right, so I see a couple familiar faces out there. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Camille. I've been working here at Chenard's for about the last 5 years, and I've been beekeeping both at home and at the store for about the last 4.5 years. So the class today we're going to go over is based on OSU's handout, Residential Beekeeping. I don't have quite enough for everybody today, but I do have the link at the end and I'd be happy to share. And I have more arriving probably next week. So the learning objectives for this class, we are going to learn 7 basic different topics here. How to locate your apiary to minimize nuisances and maximize productivity. How to judge how many colonies you should put in an area. Don't have too many in an area. You can cause lots of different problems, especially if you're in a residential area. If your bees start getting aggressive, that can cause some problems, obviously. Know how and when to provide water sources for your bees. Short answer is always provide. I know it's winter, but if you keep up on it now, it'll be easy in summer. You should learn how to reduce swarming through an understanding of swarm biology, understand when swarms are going to happen, understand how to prevent them, or how to execute them manually so that the bees are satisfied. Minimize defensive behavior in your apiary. This is not something that's always going to be a problem, but it is a seasonal thing. So depending on time of year, your bees are more likely to be aggressive or not. You're going to learn how to educate your neighbors about honeybees, make them kind of calm down and go, hey, it's not such a bad deal. Everything's fine. You're a responsible beekeeper and you're available, you're reachable. And in the event that you do receive a citation, how are you going to deal with that? So first order of business, nuisance versus an actual restriction. We don't have any actual restrictions on beekeeping specifically in this area. So the Corvallis, Philomath area and the Albany area, there are no actual restrictions. There is a nuisance ordinance, which can be used if your bees become a nuisance to your neighbor. It's the same nuisance ordinance you can use to call the cops on your neighbor that is blasting their music at 3 a.m. So a nuisance is any annoyance, inconvenience, discomfort, or injury to another person of the public. If your bees swarm into your neighbor's backyard, they've got dogs, they've got kids, they're alarmed, this is the sort of thing that's going to cause a nuisance. Municipal, county, state ordinances. I'm not going to go over everything in here, but like I said before, bees are not specifically mentioned in any of these. Oregon, the actual state does have a little bit of legislation that you do need to pay attention to if you're going to have several colonies. So if you have 5 or more colonies, you do need to register with the state. It's not very expensive for small time beekeepers. It's more for a commercial thing. So this was put into effect June of 2021. You can have 4 colonies. You don't have to do anything. If you got 4 colonies, you're set. If you have 5 colonies, you do need to register. And let's see, full-sized healthy colonies are counted. Nukes do not count. Splits don't count if they're made after June. Did you have a question?
Yeah, is that more than 4 colonies in one location, or can you have 5 colonies if you have?
That's a good question. So the question was if you have more than 4 colonies in a specific location versus if you have 4 colonies in 2 different locations. I'm not 100% sure on this one, but I believe if you are under care of both locations, then you would have to register. If you and your brother shared, maybe you had one location, your brother had another location, that would be an exception. So registration needs to be filed before June 1st of each year. I've got the website listed down here. It's pretty easy to find. And more information you can find at Oregon State Extension. There's also information in this actual booklet too. But most of you, if you're just starting off, are probably going to start with 1 or 2 colonies, and it'll be a couple of years before you make enough splits that you're actually going to have 4 or more. or 5 or more, sorry. So this is an interesting photo here. This is a good example of what a nuisance would be like. Can anybody point out what's wrong with this picture? So a couple of things. There are too many hands in the honey pot here, so to speak. We've got too many beekeepers not doing enough productive tasks. The smoker doesn't look like it's lit. There are bees everywhere. Boxes are pulled apart in multiple areas. They're set directly on the ground. If bees are getting to this point when you're inspecting 1 or 2 colonies, they're active, they're moving around, they might be trying to sting. You can hear, by the way, if they're angry versus not. You should put the colony back together again, leave the apiary, wait till they calm down, and then come back at a later time. If this is in somebody's backyard, the neighbors are not going to be happy. Okay, so we're going to locate your apiary to minimize nuisances at this point. We're going to be talking about flight paths and barriers. How far away do you need to put a hive to make it so it's not bothered? You're looking for good wind breaks. When honeybees are taken off, they don't like to take off into the wind. It makes it really difficult for them. So if you've got a nice windbreak right at the entrance of the hive, that's going to make the bees happier. That's going to make everybody in the area happier. You want good drainage. I was saying before class that moisture is your ultimate enemy here. So you want to have a nice dry apiary. You don't want any puddles or anything. Dappled sunlight is preferred, not always possible. So if you have to pick between a shady area and a sunny area, sunny is better. But if you do have like a deciduous tree or something, place your apiary near the deciduous tree so that they get lots of morning light and a little bit of afternoon shade in the heat of the summer.
Does it matter which direction you have the entrance?
It does matter which direction you have the entrance. The bees want to have the most morning light possible, so you're going to want to point the entrance either east or south or somewhere in between, depending on what the wind does in your area. It's kind of an early bird gets the worm scenario. The hive entrance that is sunlit, the bees are warm enough to fly earlier, and then they get more resources, and they're more likely to build up enough to survive the winter. So control your flight path away from high traffic areas. You can do this in multiple different ways. You can elevate your hive above the ground. Generally, your flyway in front of the hive entrance is about 6 feet before they just start to disperse, and they're not really a problem to passersby. So you can have your hive above the ground, or you can put a barrier there, or just simply have an area that you don't walk across. I have mine about 6 feet away from a slatted fence. So nobody goes in between the hive and the slatted fence, works out perfectly. They disperse at 6 feet, go through the fence, and nobody notices them.
Why at least 10 feet?
That's about, everyone's heard of the bee line. When they go from the entrance, they go straight out about 6 feet, and you've got a large volume of bees within that 6 feet. So if you're passing by, you're blocking their flyway, they're bumping into you, and that starts to agitate the bees. After 6 feet, they disperse to the point where if you walk by, they'll just fly around you. It's not a problem, generally speaking. So if you're elevating above the ground, you want to be at least 10 feet up. This also makes it so it's high enough that the average person isn't going to notice your hive and start to freak out. Barriers are helpful if you have it a little bit too close to something. Have a large shrub or a fence or something so that they're forced to go up and over as well. As long as you've got that 6 foot flyway, you should be happy. This is actually the engineering building at OSU. We've got a couple hives up here, and if you've ever been here, you probably didn't even notice it. The bees disperse and never really even see them. Apiary siding, we talked about this briefly, but you want good exposure to sun, good protection from wind. Entrance should be lit, entrance should be away from a heavy drafty wind. Another important part is you really need space to work your colonies. Some beekeepers will work their colonies from the side, others will work from the back. I tend to work from the side, so make sure that there's plenty of room for you as the beekeeper to maneuver around the backs and sides of your hive. And this is actually Jen Larson's backyard. So you can see her apiary right here. She is at OSU right now, but she used to be the beekeeper here as well. So apiary siting, you want to have maximum sun exposure and minimal wind exposure, hive spacing. Should be able to work beside them. You want the hive spaced a little bit further than super close. I would usually put my hives within about 3 feet of each other. And this gives the bees enough space to realize this is my house, this is my house. You don't want bees drifting back and forth between hives because that's how you spread diseases, varroa mites, and all these other things. So having your hives a little bit separate is beneficial as well. Keep hives away from sensitive areas. If you know you've got neighbors on this side with a bunch of kids and you've got a neighbor on this side that never uses his yard, maybe try and scoot over to the neighbor that never uses his yard. That's just basic stuff here. Keep away from high traffic areas, emergency access. If you've got one way into your yard and that's where your hive is, and you wind up having you wind up having someone with anaphylactic shock, you want the emergency people to be able to get into the yard unhindered. So make sure that there's good ways in and out of your yard and your apiary is not blocking anything. Restrict public access. If you have a yard that isn't fenced in, this can be problematic. So just make sure that you're not having random people walking around. Shouldn't be a problem for most people. Access, move equipment around in a safe manner, make sure you have enough space to work around. If it is not your property, get permission from your landlord. This isn't always an easy conversation, so the more you know, the easier it's going to be. Judge how many colonies you should place on a property. If you have too many bees in a specific area, it's going to be a problem whether or not you're a good beekeeper. And a good beekeeper is not going to overcrowd. So colony numbers, how many colonies should I fit in a space? You want to make sure that you do have space for expansion. So if you think you've got an area that will fit 4 hives, don't put 4 hives in there immediately because the following year you may have to split and suddenly it's like, oh no, what happened? I have 8 hives now and no space for them. So start out with 2 hives. If you have space for 4, the chances that you're going to go beyond that are somewhat low. So keep that in mind. And if you do have too many colonies, reach out to your local bee chapters, and there's always someone hoping to get some bees. They may be freebies, they may be bees at a price. If you've got a good nuke box together, you can probably sell that as well. This is an example of a problematic apiary. We have lots of buildings around. This is a common area. Yes, there's some pollinator plants in here. Citrus is not the best pollinator plant, mostly because of the pesticides needed to keep the trees healthy. Way too many colonies to work for one person to work here, way too many people wandering around in a common area. This is not something that you should be seeing here. There's also going to be a lot of competition and robbing activity because it looks like it's a pretty densely packed area. The bees are going to be fighting over resources, which is going to cause further trouble. Know how and when to provide water. You want to keep bees away from unpleasant water sources. For some reason or other, they're attracted to chlorine. So if you don't have a good water source, they may wind up in somebody's pool, which is a problem for you because you lose your colony to the pool, and a problem for the neighbor because now they have to clean all bees out of the pool. So you can provide water for bees in a number of different ways. You can have a water feature, a wet gravel water feature, a bowl with some marbles in it. This picture down here with the fern and the obsidian chunk, this is what I do for my bees. As long as you've got a safe area where they won't drown, they will eventually visit this. But it's really important to keep up on that water. Once the water source dries out, they realize this and they'll look elsewhere. So I fill this up every day. It doubles as my cat water, which nobody ever bothers the cat, but
If you have your hives up high, should you have your water up there too?
That's a good question. If you have your hives up high, you don't necessarily have to have the water up high. As long as it's within reach of the hive, they'll fly quite a ways. Just have water available nearby. It doesn't have to be up high. Bees tend to prefer certain water sources though. The water bowl that I have is an okay source, especially because I let the rock get a little bit algae. But bees tend to prefer water sources that are kind of mossy or algae covered because then they know that they can get out because that provides a good gripping surface. Um, One of my best bee watering spots, I've been actually trying to move it, but it's something that they've found. I've got a piece of gravel out there with a bunch of moss on it, and it stays really wet over the summer because of all over watering. It's just kind of runoff, and every year they're there. Another important thing to note though is at the water source, if someone's worried like, oh, there's a bunch of bees on my water, just let them know it's fine. They're not going to sting anybody if they're just after water. I've never seen an aggressive bee in a water source ever. Actually, I've never seen an aggressive anything at a water source. You can go straight down and pick up a wasp and they're just getting water. They're not trying to bother anybody when they're getting water.
If you have moving water, will they stay away from that?
Moving water, if it's rapidly moving, they probably won't go to it. But if it's just gently trickling like a runoff from a hose or something, they're not gonna be bothered by it.
Or if you have like a water feature?
Water features are fine too. Like they'll go after ponds and things. If you put pond plants in, then that's completely fine. They really like water lilies, for instance. The water hyacinths and water lettuce too. I've got a question in chat. How do we determine how many hives our land can handle? Is there guidance on how many hives per acre and how closely to space them? That is a good question, and everybody's going to have a slightly different answer for it. The commercial guys, just to put it kind of in perspective, will have hundreds of hives just for a couple of acres. They have them densely packed, so 4 hives per single pallet, and they've got those pretty close together too. But they have acres and acres and acres of flowering trees or crops that they're trying to pollinate, and they're heavily monitored. For a backyard beekeeper, let's say, seen a couple of different things. If anybody's familiar with the apartments up at Witham Hill Oaks with the tiny little gardens in front, I've actually seen a beekeeper have a single colony there. It's probably a little bit tight to have in a 25 by 25 area, but I have seen it done. I would say a good amount of colonies for a backyard is something like you see here. If you've got just a regular size backyard, 2 to 3 colonies is fine. I've had 3 colonies in my backyard before, and it's a similar setup to this here. If you're on a large amount of land and you know you've got lots of resources, I've had people have up to 10 to 12 hives per, I think you had 3 acres. So it depends on how many floral resources you have. It depends on how many you're comfortable working and how many you're comfortable treating for varroa mites, really. And it can be kind of an experiment too. If you have one too many one year, you'll definitely find out and you'll fix the problem the following year. It's better to start with too few than too many and work your way up though, for sure. Another question in chat, how far away can water sources be? So honeybees want the water source to be near the hive. I usually have it within about 50 feet or so. I want it to be convenient for me to fill up every single day, and I want it to be convenient for the bees to get to. But realistically, it can be quite far away. Honeybees travel typically somewhere around 3 miles from their hive just to forage. So any water source within that 3 miles is something that they will possibly look at, but the closer the better, really. All right, I think we're getting into swarming and understanding bee biology. So for all of you new beekeepers out there, swarming is a natural process, and it doesn't mean that the bees are necessarily bothered. It's actually a really good thing. Not so much if you're in town, you want to control it. But when bees are swarming, that means they're healthy, they're large. And instead of the queen reproducing on an individual level, laying a bunch of babies, they split the colony completely in half and they reproduce on a colony scale.
What does that mean?
Um, when they're reproducing on a colony scale, by splitting their hives completely in half, you have 2 colonies now instead of 1. So you're reproducing at a much greater level.
When I've seen swarms, I've seen a bunch of bees around the queen.
Mm-hmm.
That would be the colony.
Yes. Generally, when you see swarms, not all the time, there's a lot of different ways this can happen. But generally, when you swarm, the swarming colony that you see has the old queen, and the colony left behind has a brand new queen. And then there can be several after swarms too. So if you've seen a tiny little ball of bees, that's probably an after swarm with a sister queen.
So you said that you want to have space, let's say you had room for 4, but you start with 2 so that they could do that splitting.
Mhm.
Is it a good idea to have that 3rd hive ready for when they swarm so that?
That's a good question. If you have 2 colonies and you have expansion room for 4, is it a good idea to have another empty colony on hand in case this happens? Yes, it's a good idea, but it is kind of a money sink. It's really expensive to get all that extra equipment together. So maybe in the very beginning, you call the beekeeper club and go, oh, I've got a swarm on my property. Will you come and pick it up for me? If you do have the resources, it's great to have that on hand, and then you have free bees that you can put into a new colony. So it's definitely something to think about, good thing to have on hand, but there are other options if you don't have the resources to have that extra empty box.
So in this picture, they have just 1 deep and what's the other one called?
It looks like this one's actually a feeder box, so just single deeps.
Okay, so if you have 2 deeps, does that help the colony?
Having 2 deeps does help the colony not want to swarm as much, but it is not swarm proof. There's actually really no way to swarm proof a colony. If they're happy, they're healthy, it's swarm season, the drones are flying. It's just their natural biology that they want to swarm anyway. So regular hive inspections are really going to be necessary this time of year. Probably starting at about March going through June to July is usually the swarm season. It changes every year with weather though.
What's that after swarm doing?
So the after swarm doesn't always happen, but generally speaking, the first swarm, about 60% of the bees with the old queen leave the colony, and then the old queen has laid several different queen cells. If 2 of those hatch, they fight until one of them wins. Every now and then, there's a stalemate, and one of them will take off as well. Rarer cases, you'll actually have 2 sister queens in a single colony. Doesn't happen often, but I have heard that there have been instances of 2 queens in a single colony.
The popularity contest.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm. Generally speaking, 1 queen will kill all of the other queens, and you'll have 1 queen remaining, just the strongest.
So if you have a swarm, the old queen goes with the swarm. You don't have to re-queen.
That's a good question too. So if you have your colony swarm and you're left with a new unmated queen, you don't necessarily have to requeen, but it depends on the time of year. If you have an early swarm, you're swarming in March or something, there's lots of time before winter. And you can allow that colony just to let that 1 queen emerge and do her thing. You're going to have a brood break because she's not going to start laying immediately, which is actually a beneficial thing in early spring because that gets rid of any brood diseases and varroa mites that are reproducing the colony. So if you can wait and let that queen establish herself, that's a good thing. If it's later in the year and you're like, oh gosh, it's July and I just swarmed, I don't have the numbers, I don't have the resources to make it through winter, then it's a good idea to go through, find that queen that's in there that's unmated and squish her, and then the following day you get a mated queen, put her in there, and then within about 3 or 4 days you've got new eggs in that colony and you have a fighting chance.
So I come to you for a meeting.
Yes. Let's see, large healthy colonies will want to swarm. So if you have a really large colony that's confined to too few boxes like we see here, they're going to want to swarm. A young colony, many young adult workers born all at once, if there's an imbalance of ages, then they may want to swarm as well. Just the time of year will make them want to swarm. If there's a bunch of drones flying around, you've got a healthy colony, again, they're going to want to swarm. Let's see, do I have this on the next slide? Yep, okay. So hive inspections are your biggest tool against swarming and causing a disruptance with your neighbors. You want to inspect every 14 days because it takes 16 days for a new queen to hatch from an egg. Once the new queen is hatched, you're past the point of no return. Swarming is going to happen whether or not you go in and kill the old queens. So when you're going through and doing your hive inspections, you're looking at the bottoms of the frames typically. And you're looking for what beekeepers call peanuts. These are queen bees that are, instead of growing outwards, they're growing down. So they're weird peanut-shaped cells. When you see these start to grow, just cut them out. And then the old queen will continue laying new queen cells in an attempt to try to swarm. But she's not likely to leave if she knows that she's going to leave half of her colony completely queenless. She doesn't want to leave them completely destitute. So she's really going to want to push new healthy daughters hatching before she leaves. If they're running out of space, add additional boxes. Busy bees are happy bees. If they're working on new construction, they're also less likely to swarm. If your colony is simply too big, you've got both boxes on there, both brood boxes, and they still want to swarm, and you open them up and you're like, gosh, I can't even see the frames, there's too many bees. You'll want to do a split. So that means you'll want to make an artificial swarm. They're going to swarm. You can't stop them from swarming, so you swarm for them. You put the old queen, ideally, into the new location, and that tricks them into thinking they've already swarmed. There are lots of different ways to do splits, and we're not going to get into this today. But making a split can prevent your colony from swarming as well.
Do they swarm their first year or does it take 2 years?
That's a good question. Do they swarm the first year? Generally, they do not swarm the first year. Mine did. I knew they were going to swarm, but I was going on vacation and I didn't have time to really deal with it. I came back, I'm like, yep, they swarmed.
If you do
So
that
it's possible.
split, how far away do you have to move?
That's a good question too. When you do a split, how far away you have to move the colony? Again, that's something that is kind of an opinion piece. Sometimes it's better to move them further away. Sometimes you can move them just to the next hive stand. My hives are about 3 feet apart. And when I do a split, I just scoot them over. And as long as you get the old queen in the new location, chances of the split being successful are pretty high. A lot of people do walk away splits. So they'll literally just take a box, put it over into the next area, hope they got the old queen in the new location, and then they'll walk away and see which one has eggs after a couple of days. Sometimes the swarm will fail and they'll all funnel back into the original colony. So you got to keep an eye on that. You may have to do it again.
That happens again, you simply just do the split a second time, or?
You'll have to probably go in and do the manual split rather than the walk-away split.
Okay.
The thing with splitting is if you have the old queen in the old location, she's the old queen, she's the one that wants to swarm, so you haven't really fixed the biological process. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I've got a question in chat. Inspect every 14 days year-round in a certain season. That's a good question too. So every 14 days during the active bee season, during good weather, flying weather, bees start to fly when it hits 50 to 55 degrees. So swarm season generally starts around the time you start seeing drones, so probably mid-March or so. And then typically it will go until June. It can happen later. But I inspect once every 14 days, right up until the point where it starts getting rainy and nasty. And then I start again once the temperatures start rising again and we get breaks in the rain. It's equally as important that you are inspecting and leaving them alone when you should. If it's too cold, it's too rainy, you're actually doing more harm than good by getting into those boxes. For reference on getting into boxes when it's too cold, if you've got a 50-degree day right now and you know it's going to be dumping rain and freezing cold the next week, it might be a good idea just to leave them alone. Even if you know, oh, I need to feed soon, try and wait for a larger window because it takes them a good 2 days to reseal that hive and make it so it's draft proof. Another important thing about inspecting colonies and preventing swarms, you should know the difference between swarm cells and supersedure cells. The photo you see here, these are all swarm cells. This is a planned swarm event. The queen cells are at the bottom of the frame, hanging down in specifically made cells. Supersedure cells means there's something bad going on. If you see a modified worker cell on the front of this frame, it's a worker cell that's been pulled out and then going down. That means something has happened to the queen and the workers are desperately trying to raise a new queen before they can no longer modify a larva into a queen. You can only really take a brand new larva that's made to be a worker and make it into a queen for the first 3 days. After that, a worker is a worker. All bees begin the same. The queen decides whether she lays a fertilized egg or an unfertilized egg. That makes the difference between worker queen or drone. What a worker is fed determines what it becomes, kind of like fish. So next learning objective, we're going to minimize defensive behavior in your apiary. This is defensive behavior all year round, but we're going to focus mainly on fall because that's when resources become more scarce. Honeybees want to start robbing from other honeybees and yellow jackets come around too. So 4 basic cues that could cause defensive behavior in honeybees. Not a fun scenario, by the way. If you're seeing this, come back later. So vibration or noise can bother them. Screen share is bothering me. There we go. So opening a colony without smoke. Smoke disrupts alarm pheromone. Bees will excrete alarm pheromone by fanning their wings over glands. Kind of smells like bananas, I've heard, but I don't have a very good sniffer. Anyway, when you spread smoke throughout the colony, you're disrupting the scent and you're making it so the alarm pheromone doesn't spread, the bees remain calm. Opening a colony without smoke, definitely not advised. Vibrations around the colony, if you have a mower around, if you've got the weed whacker, can cause colony disturbances, but it's really important to know your colony, know your queen. Each queen is going to have a different personality, just like each of you in this room. My colonies, they don't care if I bump them with the mower. They're really calm. They're super great. Not all colonies are like that. And sometimes you might have to have a bee suit on if you're going to pass by that colony with a mower. So know your bees, do your regular hive inspections, understand what you can expect from your colony, and know when you're seeing things that you're not expecting, something is wrong. Colony genetics is basically what I was just describing here. Each queen being created differently. Colony.
Are there particular breeds that are less?
There are particular breeds that have different personalities in general. Russians, for instance, there's pros and cons to all of this. Russian bees tend to be a little bit more aggressive, but if you're in an area that's way away from people, it's not going to be such a problem. And it's actually going to be a benefit when the yellow jackets come out. If you've got a more defensive colony, they're going to have better defenses against potential robbers. You've got a really docile colony and the yellow jackets start popping up out of the ground, they're not going to stand much of a chance. So pros and cons to all of these things. Colony age structure. Colonies with older bees are more defensive. The older bees are taking on more responsibility. If your queen dies, for instance, you don't have any young bees around, you only have the older bees. They know that they don't have a queen around. They start getting defensive, they start getting grumpy. You should understand that this is happening. Go through, make sure you have a queen. If you don't, get that requeened immediately.
So how can you get a queen if it's out of season?
Okay, how can you get a queen out of season? Out of season, probably between late September and I'd say probably April. The options are very limited. But during the active season, you can usually find mated queens at certain locations. I usually have mated queens starting in April, going all the way through September. Environmental conditions can also change the behavior of your bees. So in early spring, everything's blooming, you've got decent weather, the bees are happy, you can go in there in a t-shirt and they're fine. In late summer, when the heat has dried up all the nectaries, there's not much food available, it's really hot, so they're spending a lot of energy cooling the hive, they're out looking for water. And then other bees may be robbing from them because they don't have enough. They're gonna be a little bit more on edge.
Are there other animals that will attack the hives?
There are other animals that will attack the hives besides honeybees. We're actually coming up on that, I think, in the next slide or two. We'll be talking about skunks and bears and yellow jackets and things. So work your colony or colonies in a way such as to minimize defensiveness. If you have an apiary full of, let's say, 4 or 5 hives, only work one at a time. If one becomes agitated or aggressive, put that hive away, come back when it's calmed down, work a different hive. If you're working multiple colonies at a time, you're going to start getting defensive behavior between the hives and things are going to start going haywire. Not to mention the organization process goes away and the beekeeper gets frazzled. So work one colony at a time, use your smoke accordingly to calm and control. Sometimes you're going to be using long, slow drafts just to disperse the smoke. Other times you're going to be wanting to use quick, short bursts in order to move the bees to a specific location. Let's say you're putting your equipment back together. You want to put your lid on your beehive and there's bees all over the place. Short, quick bursts to move the bees back down, and then you can safely set the lid on top. Only remove as many frames as needed to work the colony. So this is usually 1 to 3. I have a little metal stand that I have, and you can set 3 frames into that so I can easily work the rest of the colony. When inspecting multi-story hives, let's say you have 2 deeps or a couple of supers or something, keep those top boxes protected when they're aside, especially during robbing season. You don't want anybody getting into that colony. So you can use an extra telescoping top, you can use a pillowcase, you can use anything handy just to cover that. And it'll not only keep them calmer, it will keep them from being robbed as well.
You mean if you're taking off your supers, you're gonna cover them?
Yes, especially in late fall, right around honey harvest time, everybody's gonna be able to smell that. It's a really powerful scent, so yellow jackets, other bees, like, oh, unprotected honey. So make sure to cover that up while you're doing your inspections.
Is there a certain time of day that's better than another?
A certain time of day that's better than another to hive inspect. Honestly, whatever works for you, as long as you stick to your 14-day schedule, that's the most important part. They're easier to inspect generally. I would say in the mornings. They're just starting to go out, they're doing their foraging, there's less bees in the hive. The temperature hasn't spiked yet, so it's pretty easy to inspect. I only usually have time in the afternoons, and they can get a little bit angry when they're all coming back in the evening. So make sure that you're doing it before the sun is setting, before they're all coming back to the hive. But again, know your colony's personality. Don't ever inspect during active robbing activity. Before you inspect, you always just look at the entrance to the hive, just for a couple of minutes, watch the bees coming and going, see what's going on, what kind of attitude do they have today? Is there a bunch of knots of bees in the beginning fighting? Or are there a bunch of yellow jackets attacking? Or are there bees just flying everywhere? Don't inspect the hive. If you're seeing just calm bees going back and forth, go for it, they're fine.
Is there something you can do if you see a bunch of yellow?
If you do see robbing activity happening, there are some things that you can do. Other honeybees, you can try to throw a little bit of smoke at the entrance, kind of disrupt the activity. If you see yellow jackets just pounding your colony, they're all over the place. The best thing you can do is just create an artificial rainstorm. Put your hose on high and then sprinkle it over the top of your hive. Don't ever let any water get into the hive. But if you have the rain falling over the top, it's going to disrupt that behavior pretty quickly.
Do the yellow jackets respond to smoke?
I don't think the yellow jackets really respond to smoke. I've never had a robbing event bad enough to try it. But yellow jackets, they're a non-resort.
Do honeybees get caught in yellow jacket traps?
That's a good question too. Do honeybees get caught in yellow jacket traps? The answer is no. Yellow jacket traps, if you're using the pheromones, are specifically to attract yellow jackets. And if you're putting cat food in yellow jacket traps, this doesn't attract honeybees either, because the yellow jackets are carnivorous and the honeybees are vegetarian. So they don't really want to go for the same things. Other beekeeping considerations, this is particularly during robbing season here. Actually got a question in the chat here. Is there anything we might consider about native bees and other local pollinators? Also a very good question. Native bees and honeybees have different foraging habits, luckily. Typically, your native bees are really great generalists. There's over 600 native bees in Oregon, so it's kind of hard to pinpoint which ones. But a lot of your native bees are going to just pollinate everything in a small area. A lot of your honeybees are going to be target pollinators. They are generalists, so they'll go after just about anything. But if they find a really large patch of a floral resource, they are going to really want to gravitate to that specific flower. Let's say you have an apple orchard and all the apples are blooming. Then you've got a couple blooming things towards the base of the trees. Well, the honeybees are going to go after the apple blooms because they're so numerous, and they're going to ignore everything else because they're busy with the apples. So the native bees and the honeybees generally get along because they're going after different floral resources. I have seen them share very well with bumblebees, though. I've actually seen a couple of native bees bullying honeybees too, so.
What does that mean when you say yellow jackets track queens beginning of the whole thing?
I'm definitely getting to that. So robbing behavior, neighboring bees can rob. So if you've got two colonies next to each other, one colony doesn't have enough resources, one colony has plenty of resources, they may try and rob from the other. Like, oh, big dog over here's got plenty of resources, little dog over here is struggling. Big dog might just go, oh, well, I'll just take all your resources since you're struggling anyway. So take in consideration that even your two colonies could be robbing from each other. Yellow jackets cause a big problem, and a lot of people are like, oh, the yellow jackets are on my hive, let's put a trap out. That's not really going to do much because you're trapping workers. When you're putting yellow jacket traps out in the early spring, like right now or April Fool's Day, depending on what the weather does, in good flying conditions, you want those traps out. The yellow jackets, they let their entire colony die and the queens overwinter in a safe spot. So in dense leaves, underneath a table, somewhere where they're protected. So right now is the best time to trap the yellow jackets, because when you trap a queen, you're killing thousands. You're killing the entire colony by trapping the queen. Once the queen has a colony, she doesn't leave the colony anymore. And you're just trapping workers, and it's a drop in the bucket, and it doesn't really make a difference. The queens usually are out from around April Fool's Day until, I'd say, probably about a month later.
Try to dry out the yellow jackets when they invade.
Sorry?
The little bees, they won't, like in that lower left picture, the yellow jackets is dropping.
That lower picture is actually interesting. That was my fault. I just took the opportunity to take the picture. I was inspecting, and this was the honey super. I'd left the honey super uncovered. This is another reason why you really want to cover the honey super. It's not these bees' job to defend the hive. These are foraging bees right here. They're up in the top of the colony. They are actively using the honey super. The young bees, it's their job to defend the colony. So they're at the entrance. They're working on defending. All the bees up here, it's not their job. They're not going to do that. Obviously, if a yellow jacket begins to attack them, instead of just, hey, I'm a bee, I'm taking some honey, don't mind me, then they're going to do something. But these bees are foraging bees, and you want to protect your honey supers from invading yellow jackets when you're inspecting. Does that answer your question? Okay. Let's see, large predators, skunks are avoidable. They are nocturnal and they absolutely love honeybees. They're also really smart. So what they'll do is they'll come up to your hive at night. especially on warm nights when they know that the bees will actually do something. And they'll just start to scratch the entrance. Go, hey, you guys want to come out? Hey, there's something wrong. Come on, come on, come on. And they'll just sit there and eat all the bees coming out. So they can kill a colony within about a week. If you see skunk activity, check out the entrance to your hive, look for scratch marks, look for an agitated colony, and then just try and keep the skunk away. You can live trap them, you can put out a tack board in front of your colony. They have really sensitive feet, so if you have a tack board in front and they step on that tack board, they're gonna think real hard before coming back. You can elevate too. If you've got your hive probably about 6 feet up or so, they're not gonna be able to reach it.
You can't get much higher.
Yeah.
What about possums, do they?
Possums actually don't really bother my hives. I have had a couple of possums living in my backyard and my bees never got agitated. I watched the possum for a couple of nights just to see what it did. It went around the colony entrance. It picked up a couple of the dead bees that were just out there anyway. I've never actually had possums bother me at all.
And raccoons?
Raccoons can potentially bother a hive. If you have a concern about raccoons, I think they're more curious than anything. They can potentially knock the hive roof off. So put a big rock on top so that they can't lift it. Bears are probably the most difficult pest to deal with. If a bear wants your colony, that's pretty much it. It's going to get your colony. There are several things you can do to help deter that. I've heard of beekeepers putting up hot wire and putting bacon on the hot wire. Once the hot wire touches the bear's nose in particular, it's actually effective. But a little bit of hot wire, if the bear doesn't hit its nose, the bear doesn't really care either. So if you have bear problems, honestly, the best thing you can do is relocate your apiary. Being tidy is a really important part of keeping yellow jacket activity and other robbing activity down. Beeswax and honey is incredibly fragrant, and our noses are terrible. So if we can smell it, everybody else can smell it too. Never leave any wax or honey or any hive debris outside of the hive. Always clean up after your inspections. Entrance reducers are a really important tool to use. A lot of Langstroth hives have a very long entrance, and honeybees prefer to defend a smaller entrance. So you can use an entrance that reduces your entrance by half. You can use an entrance reducer that reduces your entrance to the point that 2 guard bees can defend the colony. So use those entrance reducers when you see robbing activity as well.
So you wouldn't have the reducer on all the time?
You can have the reducer on all the time. A lot of beekeepers just toss them in there and keep them in permanently. It helps with wind a little bit, helps keep a little bit more warmth in during the winter. Honeybees in the wild tend to have pretty small entrances as well. You would want to keep the entrance reducer off in times where you're really trying to ventilate the colony. Like say you're putting in a formic acid strip or something. You want that to be able to vent out. But I almost always have my entrance reducer in. Educate your neighbors about bees. This is seemingly simple, but it's probably the hardest part about keeping bees in a residential area. Especially if you're like me and I'm shy. Be in the know, come and meet your neighbors. You want to kind of gauge the meeting. Maybe your neighbors don't care that you have a colony and they don't want to talk to you. That's fine too. Just let them know that you're available if they have any questions. What I asked my neighbors, like, hey, do you like honey? He's like, meh. All right, well, do you have any allergic reactions? Nope. Do you care that I have hives? Nope. Everything's great. Some neighbors will have more questions, so it's important that you know your stuff. It's important that you're friendly and available. They may want to know the difference between wasps and bees. They might want to know, like, oh, I've got a cat. Is my cat going to be getting stung around the hive? And typically, cats know that they know. My cat does not care that I have a colony at all. But just be available and have as much information as possible for your neighbors if they need it. Differences between bees and wasps are usually pretty easy to describe, but if you've got a picture around, that's definitely helpful. Your wasps, of course, don't die when they sting. They're usually quite a bit more aggressive. Your honeybees are fluffy, so that definitely helps. Let's see. Oh, yes, yes, yes. This is silly, but it actually works quite well. Offer a free jar of honey. It usually goes a long way, except if you're my neighbor, you don't really care. We have a really good working relationship, though. I love my neighbor. Sting severity is something that you should be acutely aware of as a beekeeper. You should know if you are going to be allergic, and you should know if your neighbors are going to be allergic. You should know what to do in a case that you do see anaphylactic shock. So know the difference between a local reaction and a true anaphylactic episode. Local reactions can swell varied amounts, but they should swell in a specific area. So if you get stung on the finger, you might swell up terribly and swell all the way down to the wrist. But if it goes further and you start swelling up and getting hives in different areas, you have shortness of breath, confusion, maybe fainting, or just disillusions, then that's a lot more serious and it requires immediate emergency help. The likelihood of being stung by foragers away from the hive, so when you're not the beekeeper, is incredibly low. When they're out foraging, they don't have anybody to defend. They're just looking for some food. They're really unlikely to sting unless you smash them. If you put your foot into a shoe with a bee in it, really unlikely, it's more likely it's a wasp, then yes, they're going to sting you. But there has to be something that's going to make them want to sting you. Discuss personal stinging experience with your neighbors if they're curious, like, oh yeah, I've been stung on the ear, I've been stung in the cuticle. Let them know what they can expect. A little bit of itchiness, some swelling, a little bit of pain. It usually increases over 3 days and then begins to ebb. So for most people, it's annoying, but it's not life-threatening at all. I swell up terribly. If I get stung in the arm, right here, I'll swell up all the way up to my elbow. And it's completely fine, it's just obnoxious and I can't bend my arm very well. If I get stung on the nose, I have to stay home from work for 3 days because my eyes will shut. So it's not fun, but I'm not actually allergic. I have a really bad reaction, but I don't have any anaphylactic symptoms. Sorry, little brain fart there. An impending sense of doom and a lot of fear is also very common with anaphylaxis. So if you see someone really freaking out and having all these other symptoms, then get them help immediately. If you have an EpiPen on hand, that's great. If you don't have an EpiPen on hand, call your local fire department. They always have an EpiPen in their drug kit. So that's probably the fastest thing that you can do, aside from calling 911 and getting transferred. Just call your local fire department. Okay, so now that I've scared everybody with anaphylaxis, let's report to a citation. Anaphylaxis is fairly rare though, so hopefully none of you will ever have to deal with it. It's important to note though, as new beekeepers, that sometimes the more you get stung, the more likely you are to become anaphylaxtic. So because you're not allergic now does not mean you're not going to be allergic later. So keep that in mind, and as you get stung over and over, it will happen. Just gauge your reactions and see like, oh, I'm swelling up way worse than I used to. Just keep an eye on things. Another good thing to write down in your journal, like how many stings did I get today? Or, you know, this, that, or the other. By the way, if I'm scaring anybody, I got stung exactly this many times last year, 0. Year before it was 6. So responding to a citation. This would be a nuisance citation. Again, like I said, same nuisance laws that apply to your dorky teenage neighbor blasting their music at 3 a.m. This is the same sort of citation that the officer is going to be responding to with your colony. You want to make sure to show your due diligence that you're a beekeeper, you understand your colony. Maybe there actually is a nuisance going on and you are working on that nuisance, you understand it, and it's going to be resolved. Just be nice. The officer who's working the case probably doesn't know anything about bees. So don't overload him with information, but answer all of his questions. Show him your journal. Like, here's, I do my weekly or bi-weekly hive inspections. I know what's going on. My neighbor is maybe overreacting a little bit, but I'd like to talk about them. Just work with them. Being a member of a beekeeping community also shows your due diligence. You're like, oh, I'm part of Lynn Benton Beekeepers Association. I do all of these things to make sure that my bees are not a nuisance. They're going to be a lot more willing to work with you. Types of beekeeping records. You can keep records however you want. Some people do it on their phone, but if you get into beekeeping, you realize propolis is a thing and it's never coming off your phone. I always use paper. Waterproof notebooks work great. Typed documents, written notes. I like to write my notes in the field and then transcribe them onto the computer when I get home. Not only is it easier to keep records on my computer, it also gets it through my head. Oh, I scribbled this note down. Now it's in my head and I understand what I meant. So it's good for you, and it's good for if you do end up with a citation. Again, be respectful. The person dealing with the case probably doesn't know much about bees, so walk them through it. Offer as much pertinent information as you can without going off the deep end and going into honeybee biology and all this other stuff, which is just going to get them annoyed at you. Basically, just don't be the nuisance your bees are being accused of being. If you have a citation and it winds up being an actual citation where they want to take some sort of action, this almost never goes through. So what you want to do is you want to seek assistance immediately. Oregon State Beekeepers Association has got a lot of people who have a lot of experience with these things, and almost always the cases are absolved and you don't really need to do anything. The bees are usually kept, no fines are sent out. So seek assistance, talk to a good beekeeper. If you go through this booklet, you'll see Mike Rodea's name. He's an excellent resource as well. And I think, oh good, I do have it in here. Good Neighbor Beekeeping by Dewey Caron is a really good read, and it will actually note actual incidents of citation and their outcomes. The citations have been absolved. So you can read for yourself if you look this up. I think if you type in Good Neighbor Beekeeping Dewey Caron, you'll find it in the first or second link. So now you should be able to do all of these things, including locating your apiary to minimize nuisances, judging how many colonies per area you should place, knowing how and when to provide water, how to reduce swarming through an understanding of swarm biology, minimize defensive behavior in your apiary, educate your neighbors about bees, and respond to a citation. Some additional resources here. Check out OSU's website. They have the Master Beekeeping Program, and they have a lot of different resources as far as your residential beekeeping, your pollinator resources, all sorts of different things you can find here. You can also check out our Facebook page. We keep regular updates on our Facebook page. Usually it's a lot of cutesy things, but we will update things like when bees are going to be available, when you should be feeding, when you should be treating for varroa, that sort of thing. You can find all of our classes on our YouTube page as well. And if you have a question, feel free to email me or feel free to call me or just come straight into the store. Some of my favorite printed resources here. The Beekeeper's Handbook by Diana Samataro and Alfonso Vidabel. This first book here with the orange and black. It's one of the books that OSU uses in their Master Beekeeper program. Really great read, awesome diagrams, easy to understand. This is basically the book that I read cover to cover to get here. So highly recommend that book. The Backyard Beekeeper isn't actually in here, but if you're using Lang's hives, if you're using top bar hives, anything besides Langstroth, it's a really good read and it covers lots of different hive types. The Hive and Honeybee, I would recommend for beekeepers who've been at it for a little while and are looking for expansion on their knowledge. It goes into really crazy depth. Each chapter is written by a different expert. So awesome read, but it definitely does take a little bit of extra knowledge to read. Honeybee Biology and Beekeeping. This is an amazing read as well. It reads kind of like a textbook, but it's got a lot of good information and good pictures as well. Nectar and pollen plants of the Pacific Northwest. You'll see this one right here. It is illustrated, but it's probably the most complete book for plants in our area that are good for honeybees. And we do have this one available for sale as well. Joining beekeeping periodicals can be really helpful. American Bee Journal or Bee Culture are both really great reads. I feel that American Bee Journal is a little bit more geared towards beginners. So if you've got to pick one or the other, personally, I like American Bee Journal, but both are very good periodicals. Several online resources here. I'm sorry if I'm boring you guys, but definitely check these out. Take a picture if you'd like as well, or I can send you the slides.